Good evening, everybody. I am Susan Murray and I'm the Director of the David Hume Institute. I'm absolutely delighted to be welcoming you back here in person today. It feels like it's been such a long time and I'm really excited that this is the conversation that we're starting back with. So for those of you joining us for the first time, because there are a few, we're really pleased to welcome you. David Hume Institute is an independent think tank established in 1985 to increase diversity of thought on issues related to the economy and public policy in Scotland. For those of you in the room, please switch off your mobile phones. And I don't think I've ever said that with such glee. We are recording the event, so for those of you online, we welcome you too. You won't care online about the fire alarms, but legally, I have to tell you, there are no fire alarms planned. If the fire alarm does go off, please make your way to the nearest fire exit, which is at the back of the room, or if for some reason we can't go out that door, there's an exit just to the side there, or just behind me. Now I feel like an air hostess. And then we have to assemble at the front of the building across the road. So please keep yourself safe if it does go off, but I'm sure it won't, and we'll have a lively conversation. So now that's over, we are tweeting on social media with the hashtag DHI Conversation. For those of you online, the hashtag DHI Conversation is also the code to get into the Slido event. So if you use the Slido hashtag code DHI Conversation, you'll be able to post your questions, and I have an iPad at the front here that I will be reading them from to Jacqui and Jason shortly. Now, without further ado, I'm delighted to welcome our host for this evening, Jacqui Low. Jacqui is a strategic communicator with almost 40 years experience. I hope you don't mind me saying that, but it's an achievement. She's got experience with the media, in politics, in government and business. She was the first female special advisor to the Secretary of State of Scotland and is Vice Chairman of the National Telecare Service NHS 24 and Chairman of Partick Thistle Football Club. And Jason, I think we all know Jason. I feel like I know you personally. I know I don't, but you've been with us so much over the last few years. For those of you, just in case anyone doesn't know watching this, Jason is the National Clinical Director of the Scottish Government. He's tasked with providing advice to government and the public during the COVID-19 crisis. From a career originally in dentistry, he moved into healthcare reform and has since advised governments around the world, from Denmark to South Africa. Jason played a leading role in communications of the public health messaging throughout the pandemic. And not just that, he was a star on all our TVs, you know, and every time I saw you, you were in a different audience, and I was fascinated by how you got those messages across, from Football Focus or whatever the right name for the football programme is, to you know, meeting the SWRI and all of those. So I'm really can't wait to hear the conversation tonight. I think the two of you will, I've already heard some of your behind the scenes chat, and it was just lovely. So over to you both. We're looking forward to hearing what you say.
Thanks, Susan. I'm going to embarrass Jason by saying that when I was asked to do this, I just said yes. And because probably like everyone watching this, I felt I knew you, that if I saw you in the street, I would probably have done the awful thing of going, hi, as I walked by you. But I think tonight is about getting beyond what we all think we know about you, and to look at what it's like to be a leader in a really, really difficult time. You didn't have a rule book, didn't come with a guide, and you're still sitting here looking fairly robust, and you've made it through. So we know what we know so far through third parties, so it's your chance as well to correct any wrong impressions that you may think there have been of what you've done in the last few years. Really, to start off with, for most of us, as Susan said, you became the face on TV, the voice on the radio. But how did you actually come to be standing next to the First Minister at those daily press conferences?
Well, thank you for having me. It's lovely to see you all, and thank you to the Institute for making this happen. What a beautiful evening to have this. We should have had it outdoors, I think, on the Esplanade. Shouldn't we? There is a big stand being built at the Esplanade. I'm not sure we could have filled it. And the other thing is, Jacqui, from your introduction, I wish I'd known you before I did this, because that list of skills frankly, had the list of skills I didn't have and could have done with right at the beginning. So the official answer to your question is based on the CV, some of which was read out there. I'm a head and neck surgeon. I did a public health degree in America. I did a standard trajectory of a consultant surgeon. I ended up in America with my wife. We moved back. I ended up in government. I did safety and quality. I had a weird route through Scottish government. I stopped doing clinical work because I ended up in charge of safety and quality of the health and care system. And I became a bit of a salesman for the health service internationally, so I would travel the world talking about NHS Scotland and all the things we'd done. So we, after the Veil of Leaving inquiry, some of you will remember, where 37 women had died unnecessarily in a hospital in Glasgow, we completely transformed the safety of the Scottish health system. We got rid of infections, effectively, and a whole host of other things. And then COVID comes. And this is actually true. I'm in a small room. The First Minister and I know each other a little bit because she was the Health Secretary when I was doing safety. And we tolerate one another at some level, but we've known each other quite a long time. And we're in a room of about 6 of us, a special advisor, the Chief of Staff, and Catherine Calderwood at that time, the CMO, the Chief Nurse, me. And the First Minister of the country looks at me, and we know it's coming. Wuhan's happened, Northern Italy is happening, so we know it's coming. And she looks at me and says, "What the heck are we going to do with you?" And she's laughing, and I said, "You know what you're going to do with me, don't you?" And she says, "I know, I'm going to have to put you on the telly." And to her great credit, she realized in that meeting and subsequently that she couldn't do it by herself. That it couldn't be politically led only. It had to be politically led, of course it did. And every country in the world had that kind of leader, but she also realized she couldn't do it without a clinician. And she never gave a press conference without a clinical advisor standing beside her for 2 years. She never did a press conference by herself. Now, whether you like her, whether you think we did it right, whatever your politics, I think that moment was important. That she decided with Catherine and I initially, and then with Gregor and I subsequently, that we would always stand beside her and take those questions. She didn't always like that, so sometimes she would look at me as if, "Would you shut up now? It's my turn to speak." And I would do the same to her, of course, and say, "You're talking too long, it's my turn." So that's how we ended up in that room. It's a long answer. The second bit that people don't see, you've probably seen more, is all the stakeholder communication. So there was a massive amount of invisible work that we didn't do on the telly, where we spoke to sporting chairpersons, where we spoke to faith and belief leaders, where we spoke to young people across the country. So each sector that you can imagine in civic society around the world, the tourism industry, those who own our distilleries, we had to speak to all of them. And I did a lot of that kind of behind the scenes invisible communication to try and get the message over, to try and help these individual sectors make the right choices.
When did the significance of what you were involved in finally hit you, or was it more with hindsight?
I think it was gradual. I mean, the true significance, I'm not sure any of us even know now. We've got tens of thousands of people living with long COVID. We've got 16,000 dead. We've got 18 million dead globally. 18 million and counting. We don't know what's happening in sub-Saharan Africa. Haiti has vaccinated 1.8% of its population with a single dose. So we're halfway through a 5-year pandemic, probably, globally. So I'm not sure we know fully what we've done to our children by allegedly homeschooling them. I'm not sure we know what we've done to the business and the tourism industry. But we knew that something, a novel infectious agent with potential to be pandemic, we knew that was coming at the beginning of March, end of February. Northern Italy, we couldn't really see into Wuhan because we just couldn't see. You couldn't turn on the telly and look at Wuhan, but you could turn on the telly and look at Northern Italy. And some of you will remember the images from the north of Italy with people dying outside intensive care units. Not because Italy has a bad health system, frankly, because Italy went first. Italy were just randomly first. It could have been us, it could have been Spain. So we learned a huge amount from our Italian colleagues, and we knew then roughly who it was killing, how quickly it was transmitting, and how careful we had to be. And that's when we had the conversations about shutting the country down. I mean, it's unthinkable. I never thought I'd be in conversations about we're going to shut the schools. I mean, what? It's madness. But Italy, and then very early on, Shetland had a care home outbreak. And I've subsequently been to the care home. It's in the middle of nowhere. It's 40 miles from Lerwick in Wastview Care Home, and 7 people died really quickly. And the disease didn't have a name when those 7 people died. So we didn't even know what it was. And there were 7 people dead. So when you start to hear those kind of stories, and some of you, that one didn't make the news, but some of you will remember the Skye outbreak, the care home with Skye. And again, we realized how fast it was moving and who it was killing. That sounds awfully blunt, but those were the headlines that we were getting from our public health advisors. So February, March, we realized it was coming. We had no concept that it was going to spread throughout the world as fast and as devastatingly as it has.
You've started to paint a picture of, I feel the tension just even from that description. So you're in a fast-moving situation. You have fragments of information, but you don't have the whole picture. So as somebody leading in that situation, how do you safeguard making good decisions when things that were true 2 minutes ago may not be true now?
Yeah, so it's the key question, I think, the public inquiry. Well, I think the rest of my career might be public inquiries, frankly, but certainly the next 5 years will be public inquiries. The key, of course, is to do the best you can in the moment you're in. I mean, that's all you can do. My mum taught me that when I was 5, never mind when I was 52. And remember that what you see on the TV and at the press conference and in these big rooms is just the peak of an advisory pyramid. It's quite boring underneath that, but it's really important. So there's a guy who you'll never meet, probably most of you, called Jim McMenamin. Jim McMenamin is the clinical director of Public Health Scotland. And Susan Hopkins, who does that job in NHS England, now the UK HSA. Those 2 boffins probably did more to save lives in this country than any other person alive. And so I had them on speed dial. I had 1-800 call Jim. So I could call Jim at 11 o'clock at night and say, what the heck, Jim? I'm about to go on Radio 4, what do I say? So there's an advisory structure under there. And then there's thousands of analysts and people looking at the work globally who are, so I, very fortunately, I'm only at the tip of the spear. And my job, along with Gregor, Catherine, we've had 4 chief nurses in the period. The First Minister and I are the only 2 in the same jobs we started out in. It's quite remarkable. We're the only 2 in the same jobs. And so my role was to give her the best advice I could. And her job was to make the decisions, along with her cabinet. And there were a number of people in that room, some of whom are pretty much anonymous. I mean, the chief economist is in that room. So a guy called Gary Gillespie, who's Scotland's chief economist, a wonderful guy. And so I would say, I wouldn't say it quite like this, but let's just, for the purposes of the conversation, I would say we need to shut all the businesses. We need to shut hospitality, because people are going to die if you keep the pubs open. That's the public health advice, First Minister. You need to shut the pubs. And she'd have her head in her hands and say, and Gary Gillespie would say, okay, if that's Jason's advice, of course that's what we should do. Let me just tell you what that will do to the economy. And I'll try and estimate what that will do to employment and mental health and young people not having jobs. And so the advice is much more complex than just, you've got to shut the pubs because, now if you were shutting the pubs for 48 hours, you don't need Gary Gillespie. But once we realised we were shutting the pubs for maybe 8 months, over a summer, with no tourists, with no airlines, now you do need Gary Gillespie, because the economy is a public health challenge, just like COVID is a public health challenge. So I'm very glad I wasn't in the First Minister's seat, or Mark Drakeford's seat, or frankly Boris Johnson's seat, because that seat is pretty much impossible. There's no easy path. There's no nice, harm-free route that you could choose, and just if you're this type of politician, you could go this way politically. It wasn't like that. she had to every day make impossible choices to try and protect as many people as we could based on our advice.
You touched on critics and criticism, and I think once we got past the shock of COVID, the critical voices came in, and not all of them necessarily helpful. You're a very laid-back character. How did you react to what was a lot of very personal abuse in some cases?
So
did you amend your behaviour? Did it make you hesitate at any point?
A little. That's quite a good way of putting it. That's not the usual question. That's a good question. The usual question is, how did you deal with the abuse? That makes it much more personal. Yes, there are sometimes I did adjust, and that's where I could have done with your comms advice before I started. So I initially spoke on the telly and the radio as if I was here, as if I was talking on a sofa, or talking to my family, or and that served me well mostly.
Yeah.
But you can overspeak. Off the Ball is the classic example. Those of you who listen to the most listened to radio show in Scotland, which happens to be 2 hours on a Saturday in a football programme. So they're very nice guys, and it's funny and it's relaxed, and before you know it, you're almost swearing live on Radio Scotland, and you think your mum's going to be ashamed of you. So I on a couple of occasions, maybe more occasions, you would have to judge, overspoke. So over time I learned, and I hope I didn't, because I didn't want to be restrained either, because you can end up, have any spokesperson, what's the point? So I tried to keep that. I did a lot of phone-ins, and I did the phone-ins deliberately because I think they're helpful to speak to real people and then extrapolate that advice to a broader population. I think phone-ins help with that. But I did, if I'm honest, sometimes adjust to, so the classic one was when I said in October 2020, I said, prepare for a digital Christmas. So at the end of a Good Morning Scotland interview, they asked me randomly about Christmas. And I said, well, we're hopeful for Christmas, looking good, but if I were you, I'd prepare for a digital Christmas. Oh boy.
Oops.
In October, the world went crazy. I was on the front page of every tabloid dressed as some other nasty Christmas character. I was the Grinch, I was an elf, I was bad Santa, I was pretty much everything horror. And it turned out, if you remember Christmas 2020, I was right.
Yeah.
I was right, but I probably shouldn't have said it in October, because I hadn't prepared any of the ground. We weren't really ready for it with the government. And the First Minister that day was kind of, Jason, really? Digital Christmas? We're going to be dealing with digital Christmas now for 2.5 months. So it's some of that. But the broader abuse, remember, you have to keep in perspective. So we got Devi Sridhar, some of you will know. Yeah. Devi, you might have read her new book. It's really good, actually. She has a wonderful privilege of not being in government, which is nice. But we got sent face masks through the mail with white powder in them, with felt tip pen on them saying, I'm done. We got death threats, we got bullets on Twitter, we got all that chaos that you would expect. Lots of actually coordinated anti-vax stuff, mostly from Eastern Europe. So all of that chaos and horror. Chris Whitty got them outside his house because they found out where he lived, and it's pretty horrible. It happened to me on the train tonight. The vast majority of people are joyous and lovely. And the most common thing that happens to me is young people under 50, come up and invariably say, are you Jason? And I say, yes, thank you so much for saying hello. And their next sentence, it's happened to me 100 times, their next sentence is, my granny thinks you're great.
Oh no. Oh no.
Every single one of them happens to me every day.
Not even their mother?
Not their mother, no. So I'm everybody over 75 thinks I'm wonderful, so far. So,
just to reassure you, as a communicator, and I did watch every day, watch the...
I'm sorry.
I know, the press conferences, and I would listen to the radio, and I listened to a lot of your phone-ins and things, and there were occasions where I would slightly flinch and be slightly frightened for you, because I would know the consequences.
Yeah.
But can I say to you that having somebody that did make you feel like you were somebody they knew, made probably the delivery of some quite frightening messages much more accessible. And I think if you had had my services in advance, I would have made sure not to overcoach you, because there are some people who are good doing these things. And to give you some credit, you've got a natural affinity with people that was very reassuring at a point where we had very little to cling to.
Yeah, it's very kind of you.
So I wouldn't beat myself up too much, but
I think that's probably a combination of my parents, my mum and dad. My dad's a coal miner from Fife, and would already have this room dominated. He'd be in the middle here telling stories of, he's 83, but he'd be telling stories of his time in the pit. And my mum is a real introvert, but a fantastic, because she had to be, of course, but a real coach, and a woman based on her values, and so she would never let us deviate from that straight path, whatever that straight path happened to be. So I think it's their combination of his storytelling and her value system.
Yeah, I come from a mining family
there
too.
We are.
So
all the
there
best.
we go.
All the best people do.
All the best, absolutely. Is there one thing, if you could go back and do something differently, it doesn't even have to be government related, but over that period, is there something that you would like the chance to change or revisit?
Yes, and it's the discharge of patients from care homes. There isn't any doubt about that for all of us. I think probably every advisor in the world would do that differently. The difficulty with that answer is that we didn't have the knowledge then that we have now. If we'd known how airborne this disease was, that 30% of patients are asymptomatic and don't know they've got it, and the testing, although unbelievably scientifically good and produced really fast, isn't 100% reliable, because it can't be, no test is. If we'd known all of those things at the time, I think we would have made some different choices. But let me put that in perspective. Let's go back to Italy. So we know it's coming. We know it's going to be in the hospitals, because we can't not put these people in hospital unless we let them die in the street. So we know it's going to the hospitals. We know we've got 1,500 people who don't need to be in the hospital, who need to be discharged from hospital, but there's no place for them. And that's why we took them out. We took them out to protect them, to try and make it safer. Now, there'll be people in here who probably lost relatives. That's no consolation. My explanation of it is no consolation. But that's why we did that. So if we could go back, and the First Minister has said this publicly as well, if we could go back and make different choices about that moment in March, April, before the big first wave, I think all of us would like to have that time again. I think that will stay with us for the rest of our careers. And not just here, Portuguese people, Spanish individuals who do my job, all of us who made those same kind of choices. I think with the best of intentions in the moment, but if we could do it again, I think we'd do it differently.
You talked a bit there about the programs you appeared on and that you were targeted to talk to certain groups. So it sounds like the communications was quite organised, it was not thrown together. But for many of us, I think the whole COVID experience brought something to our attention that we really weren't aware of, and that was campaigns of misinformation that, brought forward conspiracy theories, all sorts of things. How did you tackle that when it became apparent that it wasn't just the odd person who was a bit strange and had their tinfoil helmet on? Did it begin to impact on...
Those and the tinfoil helmets do actually exist. But so it's really interesting, because I hadn't appreciated your profession, and I use profession deliberately.
Okay.
I hadn't appreciated there was a science, really. I had done a little bit of comms, because I talked to healthcare rooms and conferences and that kind of thing, and I'd done a bit of news comms when there was a health thing, but occasional. And I hadn't realised how designed it can be. So the marketing people would say, we've got a vaccination problem with the 30 to 40-year-olds. I'd say, well, okay. So we're going to go and speak to the 30 to 40-year-olds. I said, how are we going to do that? And they knew how to speak to the 30 to 40-year-olds. I was asked by an MSP at a committee, why are we not doing more for the teenagers? Why are we not communicating more to the teenagers? And by this time I had learned a little bit about comms, and I said to him, how would you know? because communication to teenagers is invisible to the 59-year-old MSP. He can't see it. So the science behind it was fascinating to me. So I've spoken to the Polish radio stations in Scotland, the African diaspora radio station that gets broadcast from Africa but is listened to by Africans in Scotland. We've got a gypsy traveller community who get their news from entirely different sources from most of the rest of us. We've got young people who, I don't know what they do, but I taught Young Scots Health Panel the science, 16 young people, and they taught the young people of Scotland the science. I didn't. I coached the 16 young people who Young Scot have as a thing. So all of that was fascinating. Then there's the other side of that particular coin, which is the disinformation. So some of that, your advice would have been helpful, I'm quite sure, during it. So roughly speaking, the people who were helping us divided them into 3 groups. The real extreme conspiracy stuff. So the stuff that says we're all going to die, Gates is chipping us all with the vaccine, all of that, the full-on edge, ignore it. Report it to the security services and don't do anything. Do not engage them on Twitter, don't do anything with them. And that was quite hard, because my instinct is to argue, and I got better at not arguing. I have met a few of them in the street where it's impossible not to argue because they're right there, and you try and you make it worse. You invariably make it worse. There's just no reason at all. We're in the David Hume Institute. There's no reason at all. So that group you ignore. The next group are skeptical, but they've usually got legitimate questions. So they might be pregnant mums. They might be young people who think, I'm 14, why would I do this? Those are the ones you spend your time on. So all the advice was to engage with that group thoroughly, with evidence, with trusted voices, as much as we possibly could. And then there's a kind of an amorphous group over here who are just a bit lazy, who don't engage, who don't listen to routine stuff. They don't come to the vaccine clinic because I'm a bit busy. So that group, comms doesn't really help. You've got to take the thing you need out to them. So you've got to deliver the vaccine to the house. You've got to go to the school with the testing. So that needs a system change, not just a comms change. And that's how we tried to do it. And I spent a lot of time with that middle group who were skeptical or who had questions. And we had behavioural science advice. Some of you will have seen Steve Riker on the telly a lot, who's Scotland's key behavioural scientist guy, and we had him on all our advisory groups. And he was hugely helpful in how to cut through some of that challenge.
Trust was a huge issue from beginning to end and still ongoing.
Yep, still now.
How did you manage to keep that trust? Were you aware there were points where it was waning and you had to actively pull it back in?
Yeah, we were. The First Minister, and it's a politician's skill. You may have seen it in your time closer to them and in others. But good politicians can feel the public mood. I can't. I don't know how they do that. But she would quite often in the morning. So I would go in. We basically spent the whole day for months. We were spending the whole day together, really. So we would do pre-brief before the conference, and then we would do the work in the afternoon to try and work out what the heck we were going to do next. And we would say, no, we're going to have to push further. We're going to have to. So these levels that we've got, we're going to have to get these numbers down by doing this, this, and this. But it means really harder restrictions. And she would say, the public will not do that. And I'd look at her as if, what are you talking about? How do you know? She was almost always right. So we would then do polling on a Friday where you'd actually ask the public, very, very deep polling that we did for months about how you felt about face coverings, what you thought about your kids at homeschooling, what you thought about the vulnerable, were you willing to sacrifice your freedom in order for the neighbour to be protected? All of that, quite really hard questions. And she was invariably, she had the public mood right. And I think good politicians, irrespective of party, can feel that public mood thing. I found that quite difficult. And our trust numbers, whatever that means, in polling, stayed invariably high till till the end, really, till then we started to move stuff back, and now trust is back to normal for politicians. But during that 2-year period, our trust numbers compared even to Wales, actually, the key difference in Wales, I don't know when the history is written. So Mark Drakeford did the press conferences by himself.
Yeah.
He never had a clinician, and I think that mattered in Wales. You'd have to ask the Welsh whether that mattered to them. But in England, we've seen what happened in England and subsequently. Although the public do trust Chris Whitty has very high trust scores, but he didn't get on the telly as much as some of the rest of us, and his voice was quieter than some of the rest of us. So it's back to my mum again. My mum always told me at times of crisis, revert to the truth. So I tried to tell the truth, and if people don't trust that, then that's a problem with them, not with us.
Just to come on to a couple of sort of more personal questions before we open it up. I worked on a number of high-profile things, including Lockerbie, where from the date that it happened until Christmas was 4 days, and I'd done sort of 24-hour shifts all the way through for those 4 days, and sat down on Christmas Day for Christmas dinner and felt like an alien who'd just landed amongst the normal people, because I couldn't disengage what I knew, what I'd seen,
Yep.
and all of the experience I'd just had in that very short period. I couldn't unknow what I knew. So for you personally, the toll that this has taken on you, has it left a mark?
So almost certainly, not all bad. So some of that for good. I think your comparison, you had, that's acute trauma. I mean, that's in the moment acute trauma. Mine was more dragged out than that. And let's be honest, I wasn't in an intensive care unit every day. Some of my pals are never going to recover. Some of the people who ran care homes or went, so that in that Westview care home in Shetland, there was a young lady who was the domestic supervisor. She was the cleaner, and the bus wouldn't take her to work because nobody knew what this plague was. She was 40 miles from any shop, and the shop wouldn't serve the social care workers because they were scared. Yeah. So that's actual trauma. So not to diminish, I'm not trying to be a hero, not to diminish what we've been through in the government. I think it will leave a lasting mark. It will leave a lasting mark of some joy, of some purpose, of some mission. The only thing worse than having this role would have been not having it. I mean, I can't imagine not having something to do during this period. But it has had an effect on family, on engagement. We didn't have a day off. I mean, I figure Mrs. Leitch didn't really have a day off either. In 2 years, we just had a week away at Easter in the Canary Islands for the first time, first days off really. And I went to the pictures last Saturday to see Maverick Top Gun, and it's outstanding.
Good.
But I sat through the whole film, and my phone was on the chair, on the arm of the chair, and it didn't ring. And I came out and I said to Lynn, that's the first time we've been at the movies for 2.5 years where it's been undisturbed. So that felt like a moment.
A win.
Felt like something had happened.
Yeah.
So either nobody cares anymore, nobody loves me, or you have to be careful actually, because you can end up down that rabbit hole that you seek that adrenaline all the time. People do that, but I'm not. I'm very happy to relax into it. In order to keep that, I've got a very supportive family who have kept my feet firmly on the ground. I run every day. I run 5K every day, or try and run 5K every day, and I sleep well. I'm not up 4 a.m, still up worrying or still up working. I go to my bed, and because I'm better the next day if I go to my bed. So if I can get 8 hours sleep and run 5K and eat relatively well, then I can keep going.
Is there anything that you've learned about yourself that's surprised you?
I think Granny's favourite is a bit of a surprise.
So's Tom Jones.
That's good company. I might hold on to that. That's not terrible company. I didn't know that the comms, and you were very kind in your description of it. If you told me 2 years ago that I would do 16 interviews in a day and 1,200 and whatever it was, and have the energy to be able to do that and be able to try and translate what is actually really quite hard, both advice and science, into human language. Now, the reason I can do that is I have to do that for myself to understand it. That's not just to teach other people. It's not that I understand the really hard stuff. It's the opposite. I've had to have the really hard stuff explained to me by people, and then I can then translate that to others. So I'm quite surprised that I've been able to maintain that. The other thing is the energy of it, the ability to keep going within a team of people, because it's a huge team of people. You can imagine, underneath me and around me are a set of people who are better at their jobs than I would be at their jobs. And that sounds a bit twee, that's leadership consultancy 101, isn't it? That surround yourself with people who are better than you at the stuff you need them to do. But that's what I did. I had a team right at the beginning who we'd worked together for years, one of whom is a great communicator, one of whom's a great civil servant, so we ended up with a team around me that then would put me on the telly. They'd watched for the first 3 months and then got fed up and stopped watching and just kept pushing me out there.
So what's next after that? What follows that?
That is a really hard question, and I honestly don't know what's next professionally. What's next on a personal level is some time to decompress a little bit. So the job is coming back to normal. So I'm starting to do some overseas speaking engagements. We're starting to get back to run the cancer plan. We've got lots of work to do with a backlog. We had a meeting today as the Scottish Government directors thinking about what the next phase is. There is actually also a big piece of work about public inquiry, about learning, and I hope the public inquiry will be that. I hope it will be truth and reconciliation rather than blame and looking for folk to charge with manslaughter. I really hope we're not in, because we can do that version, but it's just going to take a long, long time and lead to misery. I'd much rather be over here doing the truth and reconciliation version where I could speak openly, where families could speak openly, and we could come to maybe some learning that would help us. And then professionally, this job before the pandemic was hugely worthwhile and hugely engaging. Whether that's what I end up doing or not, I honestly don't know.
Granny's favourite. You could do anything on the back of that.
Is there a chat show just for 75-year-olds? Just for the over 75?
I think
maybe it'd be a
Saga. Give Saga the idea.
Saga. I could be the MC on Saga Cruises. How about that? Stand-up comedy on Saga Cruises.
Oh, can I tell you before we offend any more of the audience? Saga is for the 50s and over.
There we are. Even better. I would fit right in.
You'd be perfect for it. And I could talk to you literally. I have so many more questions to ask you about all the things you've been involved in, but I am very conscious we have both an audience here and we have an online audience who are desperate to ask questions. So Susan's going to help us with that.
Fantastic. We're just going to do a technical reshuffle. Oh no, we're fine. Okay, we thought we had a rustle on your mic for online, so apologies if we've had a temporary technical hitch. It's now fixed. So that's grand. Right, we'll come to the room first. Who wants to be our first questioner? We'll go to David Middleton first, and then the man behind afterwards. Okay. No, you. Yeah, no.
Okay, sorry. Thank you very much for that very interesting discussion. I was wondering whether at any point all those advisors you were working with were discussing the Swedish approach. And if so, what was the argument for not following it? And thirdly, why wasn't that communicated, that discussion that took place?
So one of my best friends is the chief executive of the Swedish health system in one of the regions of Sweden. So I know it relatively well. We did look at Sweden, we looked at Cuba, we looked at Portugal, we looked at Spain. We met as a group of international experts relatively regularly. The UK clinical advisors met every Tuesday and Thursday night for a year, and then every Tuesday night for a further year. So the 4 CMOs, the people who do my job, the public health leads, and we had a group of people doing international comparisons all the time. The WHO held that together principally for us, And the WHO advice, of course, has to apply to 197 countries. So you have to then interpret it and translate it for your culture. You okay? I thought you were waving in. No, I didn't. Okay, sorry. So yes, we looked at it. The headline in the newspapers of what Sweden did is not actually the reality of what Sweden did. Sweden did voluntary a lot of the things we did compulsorily, and the population was very compliant. How terribly Swedish. It's a little bit of a caricature of what they did. But my colleagues would tell me that although they didn't shut hospitality, everybody who went stayed very far apart. They wore face coverings. They did so. No, the schools weren't closed. That's good. Yep, they were, and that was a choice that they made. If you look at the data comparing mortality, infections, then I think it's too early to say. And which data point do you use for judgment? Do you use excess mortality? If you use excess mortality, then the UK is in the middle of the pack for the developed world. That's probably the best data point to use. Yes, it is. It is. For Sweden. For Sweden. That's the crucial point.
You didn't communicate what you said in public earlier. That was back at me at the time.
So I did 1,200 interviews. I'm not sure you heard them all. So we talked about Sweden fairly regularly. Maybe not at the podium, but if I was asked about Sweden, I talked about Sweden. I was very happy to talk about it. Mark McLaughlin of the Times was probably our international comparator guy, journalist, and he spent quite a lot of time investigating what had happened in other countries. I don't know, but I don't think you, and I know this is not what you're suggesting, but I don't think you can take one country's version of COVID response and apply it in a cookie cutter fashion to a different culture. So the obvious example in Scotland compared to Sweden is massive inequalities, enormous inequalities. Probably the biggest inequalities in the Western world, in Glasgow, that Sweden simply does not have. So therefore your response has to look different here from the Swedish response. Now, the extrapolation of that is all the more reason to keep the schools open because of the inequality, and you may well be right.
Jason, thanks very much, and well done on everything. You mentioned a few times how you had to just prepare your mind for communications. And I guess there would be times when various questions would be trying to draw a distinction between our approach and the approach in England from a small p political perspective, or even a capital P political perspective. And I wonder just how you managed to approach that and keep that in mind without in any sense going off message. And if I may, just a more narrow question, and I say this as a non-health professional, it seemed to take a while to work out whether face coverings were good, bad, desirable, undesirable. And I just wondered if you had any reflections on that.
I think we're still not absolutely certain. And face coverings has been a fascinating scientific journey for those of us who are used to very, very hard concrete evidence. So if you take a statin, I'm 53 from the west of Scotland, it's kind of compulsory. So if I know the double-blind trial of statins that will make sure it reduces my cholesterol. I know that is a good thing for me to do. Face coverings is not as neat as that, particularly with a novel infection that didn't exist 2.5 years ago, and we had to do the trials in real time. Quite a lot of the anecdote of Southeast Asia wears face coverings, that's why they're doing better, that's simply not the case. That wasn't the single thing that was making Southeast Asia different from Western Europe. I think we've now understood, Germany has helped us, because Germany were very strong on face coverings quite early on. And then we learned about the airborne nature of this disease. Don't believe the people who told you, who say they knew it was airborne all along. They didn't. That's hindsight. Now we know it's more airborne than we ever believed. And now we know that certainly well-worn, well-sealed face coverings do reduce the viral load in a room like this. But so do the windows. And the windows are probably more important than the face coverings in the round. So it's all of that together. It's the ventilation, the face coverings, the hand washing, the no disease in the room if you can possibly avoid it. So all that testing before you turn up. Now your UK, England versus Scotland point is well made. I got very good at saying, I'm not a politician, I'm a clinician. And I also was very, very careful, even when I thought they were maybe going in the wrong direction, never to criticise my colleagues in Sweden, in England, in Wales. I think it was really important that the clinical teams stayed together and supportive of one another. So it's quite easy in an answer to escalate to the WHO. So you can kind of go to, well, the guiding advice for us as clinicians is the World Health Organization. They're saying this about face coverings. That's what we're going to tell the Scottish population. We're going to interpret that for our culture, for our demographics, but here's what we're going to do. So I was very cautious not to say that England was doing this or that. FM in the main did that as well, certainly in the first year from the podium. She was careful to say this is what we're going to do based on the advice I'm getting. That's up to them. It got a little bit dodgier near the end when the money became a problem, where choices England were making meant that we were going to have less funding to do some of the things we were suggesting in advice that we should do. That's when it got a bit harder for her. It's the same for me, but it got a bit harder for her.
You mentioned the example in Shetland of the woman who couldn't get a bus and couldn't get food, and I'm sure that will have a legacy in that community and for individuals. And on the flip side, I was vulnerable and I stayed in my house for a long time, and I was really grateful for all the people that made sacrifices and completely changed their life to keep so many other people safe. And it changed the way I felt about Scotland. I feel really lucky and grateful to live here. And I wondered, did this experience trigger any thoughts or feelings for you about Scotland and the character of the people here?
That's a great question. I have the same feeling of the kindness, and so I learned the mobile phone numbers of my neighbours. I didn't have the mobile phone numbers of my neighbours. They put slips through my door to say, do you need shopping? I know you're really busy. Is there anything we can do for you? And we did the same to neighbours. I live quite near the Sikh Gurdwara in Glasgow, and they made 3,000 curries a day for the whole pandemic. And you should never go hungry in Glasgow because they will serve anybody any afternoon with a hot meal. And they took them out on the road for the first time in this period. And I hope we keep some of that kindness. In the Orkney vaccination centre when I went to visit quite recently, I'm on a kind of thank you tour of the health boards of Scotland, whether they like it or not. So I was in the vaccination centre and I met the volunteers. And there was an elderly gentleman at the front door who'd been there every single day, rain or shine, for no money at all, and had done all the front door registration and welcoming for basically the whole Orkney population. And the man was, he couldn't buy it. It's priceless kindness to the population. I hope we hold some of that. I don't think we need to clap on our doorsteps every Tuesday night, but I hope we keep some of that. Your broader point about the nature of society and how we should help you, I think, is a fascinating study. And it felt near the end, or we're not at the end, it felt more recently that's been harder. Because of the economic challenges, because of the nature of the virus, what we began to learn about vaccination, how I was more protected now, changing my behavior for you now seems like a bigger ask. And I'm sure you feel that. My parents feel it because they're 82 and a bit vulnerable and have struggled with re-engagement with society, particularly my mum, re-engaging with the things that she would do. She's now a bit more scared to do that than she would have been before because she doesn't trust people on the trains and she doesn't think the buses are as safe as they were before. So that's a really interesting broader public health challenge, because that's the difference between my diabetes doesn't matter to you. If I were diabetic, I'm not, but my diabetes doesn't matter to you, but my COVID matters to you still.
I'm just going to do some quick fire questions from Slido, if that's okay. I'll come back to that in a second, Sheila. Some people noticed you looked healthier now than they thought you did at the beginning. Did you take up running throughout this, or did you run before and now you just run further?
I had a down period, let's call it. So I've been I'm not really a runner. Runner would be an exaggeration, but I had a fat phase, just pre and first phase of the pandemic. So lost 2 stone from alpha to delta.
Wow. Gosh, well,
Deliberate,
it was
deliberate,
noticed by the audience.
And the telly also adds quite a lot. The telly not
Well, I think the word role model there is what they're saying, but not using it. There's another question about stress levels, and you mentioned the running. Is there anything else you did to help you de-stress?
So family, I'm quite good at compartmentalising. Health and social consultants and senior nurses tend to, in their training. So I did head and neck surgery for years. I've held the hands of people who have died of cancer. I've comforted families who have lost young people to oral cancer. I've picked people up off the road when their jaws are in bits. So I have got a compartment. Some psychologists would tell you not to do that, but I am quite good at that. I can switch off. I can't remember the last time I didn't sleep well. I mean, honestly, even in this chaos. Sometimes if I drink too much, it gets a bit dodgy. And I don't do that very often. So I'm very good at compartmentalising it, and I have genuinely. My wife's an English teacher. She's been hugely supportive. We as much as possible we sit down for dinner every evening, even if it's quite late, and we eat together and we talk together about her teaching day rather than my chaotic day. So it's just normal life, family things to try and manage it. And then other stuff happens, of course, and the First Minister phones at a dinner table and you ignore it, and then stress goes up again.
A more serious question next. Do you feel the main challenges facing governments you advise are largely similar to the ones across the world, or are they unique? You've mentioned the health inequalities in Scotland, but there are health inequalities elsewhere in the world. Do you want to say anything about that?
Yeah, so I think in the global north, let's call it, so in principally the developed world, I think the challenges are similar but of different scales, and depending on which country you look at, the one you might want to look at is slightly different. Some places have no functional health system, even in Western Europe, that you could describe. So and then if you went to the US, you'd find a health system that has probably the best healthcare in the world, but also some of the worst care in the Western world in one country. And they're spending twice as much on health and social care as we are. In the global south, I think the challenges are entirely different. They're about universal health provision. Well, we can't provide universal health care to most of the world. And vaccination is just the latest shiny example of it. Ethiopia and Nigeria have vaccinated 3 people per 100. We've given 250 doses of vaccine per 100 people. So the average across the country is 2.5 doses. Some have had 4, some have had 1, but 2.5 doses per 100. And Haiti, the last time I looked, I think we said this, was 1.8 per 100 people. You can't solve a global pandemic unless you tackle it globally. And that same thing for vaccination applies to insulin for diabetes, or statins for cholesterol, or whatever it happens to be. Horribly, some of the reason the death toll is lower in some sub-Saharan African countries is because there's no old people left. I mean, you can't believe you're saying that out loud in 2022. So there are massive health inequalities globally, but that shouldn't stop us thinking about the global health and the health inequalities we have across Scotland. The best protector against COVID was wealth. You were more likely to self-isolate. You're more likely to have a supportive family who could look after you. You're more likely to keep your job. So wealth was still your best protector against COVID, even though some rich people died. On average, your best protection against COVID was wealth.
So does that mean, I'm combining a question here about the next nasty variant with, when the next nasty variant comes, are we going to be worse off because we'll also be in a cost of living crisis?
Potentially. The next variant will come from one of 2 places, and it will come. We've had 4 in 20 months, so August looks promising. Sorry. And there'll probably people in here who do know the Greek alphabet. I really hope don't need to learn the Greek alphabet during COVID. So it will come from one of two places. It will come from an unvaccinated country or a highly vaccinated country with high prevalence, because the only way it can find its way is by adapting. So for a while, that looked like us. Now we're on the way down, probably not us now. Portugal doesn't look great. So Portugal, high vaccination and high numbers. That's a recipe for viral disaster, because it will find a way through. And anything that stops you being able to react from a public health perspective, whether that's fatigue in the public for some of the things you might have to do, whether it's greater inequalities because of cost of living or whatever it happens to be, or it's an earthquake in your country or wherever, all of that makes public health harder. So if you are presented with a public health challenge and you have a more unequal society, that's worse.
Okay. One more question and then we'll come back to the room is, do you think young people had their voices heard enough during the pandemic?
No, I don't think they did. I think we tried hard at the beginning, partly because of the pace of events. We learned pretty early on that this was a disease related to immunity, and therefore your risk was related to your immune system. Therefore, the elderly and those with pre-existing conditions were our principal concern. That was quite unusual in a 13-year-old. Not impossible, but quite unusual in a 13-year-old. And therefore, we pivoted as much as we could to protect that group with this novel infectious agent. As we then began to do stuff to society, I was going to say inadvertently, not inadvertently, quite consciously, you don't necessarily affect that group you're trying to protect. The people who are having the main effect of it are the school kids, the business owners, the taxi drivers, the sports people who we shut down, all of that bit over here, while trying to protect those with immune systems that aren't up to the job of protecting themselves from the disease. That's when we probably should have done more with those young people. Now, the communication did try and change and try and address them. I spent a lot of time with them, particularly around vaccination, of course, when we're trying to change behaviour. But we could probably have spent more time with them trying to engage and hear their voices. But we were trying to protect a group that wasn't them.
Yeah. Back to the room in the back corner. Mark.
Okay. Hi, Jason. How are you doing? It was a very quick question, actually. I wondered, particularly at the beginning of the pandemic, how much, if any, information you were keeping back because you thought it might scare or panic people too much?
None. I mean, when the history is written, you might find some. But we published our modelling pretty early on and regularly. We ended up publishing modelling every week. We probably didn't do that right at the beginning. Some of that modelling was completely terrifying. Some of that modelling was your health service is going to be overwhelmed 6 weeks from now, and you're going to have no beds for any disease other than COVID, and that's why you need to build the Louisa Jordan. So we published the modelling for that, and that was without mitigation, remember. That was, if you don't lock down, this is what's going to happen. Now, you can argue about the modelling. It's a sport to argue whether that modelling is right or wrong or indifferent, because it's a guess. A lot of it it's based on some analysis, but much of it was guesswork. We were considered in our communication in not panicking the crowd as much as we could, but trying to tell the truth. There was quite an infamous day in our minds the Christmas lockdown of 2020, when the digital Christmas did become reality. And that press conference was a Sunday, and I wore a tie, which was quite unusual, because the chief of staff had sent me a message saying, we're going to do a press conference today. We weren't expecting it. Could you wear a tie? And I thought, what? And I knew we were shutting the country down again. So I put a tie on and I walked into the room, and the First Minister said, why have you got a tie on? And I said, she told me to wear one. And she said, I thought it was getting quite serious today, so we thought we'd put a tie on. And so I wore a tie for the press conference. And Twitter went completely mental. Mental, full of, we're all going to die. Leitch is wearing a tie. It's clearly the end of the world. And I'd scared all the 10-year-olds. I've got pals with 10-year-olds for some reason. I don't know why they're all 10, but a number of them sent me messages immediately afterwards saying, my 10-year-old ran into the living room to say, Jason's got a tie on, we're all going to die. I scared the children of Scotland.
Oh, okay. Hi, Jason. Just to say first off, one French word, chapeau, which is hats off.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. I was driving down the M74 one day and heard you on a radio phone-in with, particularly, it seemed to be people from the Highlands, and I was really impressed. You know, you were dealing with a mixture of basic questions, quite a lot of challenges about what was or wasn't being delivered in the Highlands. What led you to go to that sort of comms level? You know, it was not the macro level of, say, England was on with the advisors. And there you were taking these personal phone-in challenges and discussions. And it was really impressive. What led to doing that?
It's an interesting question because initially the comms advisors didn't want me to do it. And I rarely pushed back against them because they're usually right. But remember, the Scottish Government Communications Department usually deals with ministers. They're not we were a new customer for them. So the Scottish Government Comms Department is designed around the First Minister and the ministers and the controlling that version of the message. And the advice that I was getting initially looked like ministerial advice. So it looked like protecting the message a little bit. So over time, as I got to know them a bit more, as we got a bit more used to it, and they began to trust me a bit more, that I wasn't going to completely cock it up. I was only going to partially cock it up. Because every time you're on the radio, remember, I hadn't really appreciated this. So every time I did a TV thing or a radio thing, the written press would then ask our comms department for more information. So every time I'm on the radio, I create work for other people. And I hadn't really appreciated that when I was starting off. So that's quite a lot of work for people on a Sunday afternoon who are relatively junior comms officers. So eventually I began to push back and say, look, I know this isn't Radio 4 and it's not got a big audience and it's not, but actually Call K is what quite a lot of the people locked in their houses are listening to. And if we can talk to Barbara in Inverness, maybe Jean in the Borders is going to hear the same message. So what I tried to do was take the Inverness story, whatever it was, and answer the question, and then try and give advice about weddings more generally to the people who were living in Dumfries and in the Borders. And I think that worked. I mean, sometimes there's probably nobody listening except my mother, but who eventually stopped, even she stopped listening.
Did you not also do Loose Women?
I did. No, I did Lorraine. That was the.
Oh, okay, Lorraine.
I did the
right.
peak. My peak COVID day was Lorraine Kelly.
That was, my mum saw you on
My
that.
mum was the proudest she's ever, never mind my PhD, she was the proudest she'd ever been that I'd managed to get on Lorraine. So trying to speak to people where they were, rather than just the bubble that listened to GMS every morning. You need to do GMS because the bubble listens, and all the journalists listen, and all the MSPs listen. So that's important because you can set the agenda for the rest of the day if you get it right. But then talking to Call K or Off the Ball, or I was on Radio 1's chart show, for heaven's sake. I mean, what on earth are you doing on Radio Clyde's chart show? But it's to speak to an entirely different demographic that weren't reading The Guardian, it turns out.
Hi, Jason. I'm wondering about the interaction of sort of COVID as normal with other policy areas. And if I can give you a quick example in my world of building stuff, schools leaving their windows open to help with ventilation has caused energy bills for councils to go up 20, 30% or whatever it was last year, more with the cost of living. Where do you see the biggest interactions of COVID as normal with other areas of life?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and we've thought a lot about what mitigations now are, because we hoped in the beginning I think we all hoped that there would be COVID and then no COVID, and it became pretty apparent early on that there was a new infectious agent and a new infectious disease that was going to be with us probably for the foreseeable future, maybe forever, and we were going to have to mitigate against it. So actually, longer term, I think new buildings will have to think about COVID, just like they think about other elements of health, and ventilation will be different in new builds than it would have been pre-COVID. That doesn't help us now, of course, when we're dealing with Victorian hospitals. And so again on the tour of the country, I mean, Aberdeen Royal Infirmary is still heated by steam pipes that run underneath it's the dark ages. I met an apprentice, a young apprentice early in the morning who was fixing this this thing. I said, what the heck's that? And he said, I've absolutely no idea. The old guy's got to come and tell me. Because he hadn't done it in college. It was so old. So I think COVID will touch every element of our society, from our theatres that we visit, to our buildings, to our schools, to our health system. And in the health system, we're having to adapt because we've created a disease. We've got a disease that probably has 500 people in hospital for the foreseeable future, roughly. And we haven't taken any disease away. We've only got 15,000 beds in the country. So if you're going to give me between 500 and 1,000 beds even out over the year, what's your plan? That's a new Glasgow Royal Infirmary, if that's what we have to do. So we're going to have to adapt to that in every element of society. I was on the train. That's the first time I've been on the train, not a single mask. So I've seen I'm the only guy who's commuting less now than he was. So I was on that train every day for a spell, and because I live in Glasgow but work here, and so the world is definitely changing. But what does that mean for us? What does that mean for us going forward? I think the whole of society has to help us answer that.
Mm-hmm. We're rapidly running out of time. Jacqui, I'm really interested. If you were in that team advising Jason, would you have let him on all those radio shows at the beginning, or do you think times have changed so much from when because you worked on Piper Alpha, you worked on Lockerbie, was there not a Perth prison riot as well? You've seen a fair few crises.
Yeah. No, I think I would have recognised there are some people who have an innate ability to communicate with others that you can't teach them. What you can do is you can encourage them and support them. And I probably would have been looking at Jason, rubbing my hands, not from the granny perspective, but I would have, because I would have seen that at a moment where we needed to make that connection, we needed to get people to trust us. You've got somebody there that was slightly raw, but actually for all of that, that was what made it real and genuine. And so I would have probably been saying to him, you've only done 1,200, why haven't you done 1,400? Why haven't you done? I would have loved to have worked with somebody.
You're very kind. The First Minister said that in her brighter moments when she wasn't yelling or annoyed because I'd said something, because I'd overspoken. She realised that. Catherine at the beginning as well. Catherine had a particular demographic that she was very, very good at speaking to. You wouldn't put Catherine on Call K because that's not Catherine's skill, but Catherine was really good at speaking to the clinical professionals, and so you use people for whichever bit. And First Minister had a very clear understanding of what that was. She guided it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. If there was one thing you want to leave us thinking about, Jason, what would it be?
The question that has stuck with me, I don't know your name in the back row. That your question is the one that stuck
Lorraine.
with me. I'm sorry.
That's okay. It's another Lorraine. I can tell you that.
Lorraine. So there's something about society, isn't there, and its reaction to an emergency. Mm-hmm. And we've all come together. Partick Thistle changed its behaviour. You as an individual changed your behaviour. I changed. We all changed our behaviour for this 2-year thing. What should we do? Should we just go back to how it was before? I mean, it wasn't so bad. But is there something or other things that we should keep? Is it the kindness of the Sikh community in the West End of Glasgow? Is it the ability to deal with public health in a different way? So should we now talk about nutrition and obesity and smoking and all those other things in a different way with the population that we haven't been able to do before? Should Off the Ball do a public health segment once a month on another? So the last time I was on Off the Ball, would you believe, Scottish Government comms said, we want you to go on Off the Ball. And I said, well, there's nothing to talk about. There's no COVID. And they said, no, we want you to go on and talk about the census. So I ended up... I said, I don't know anything about the census. And they said, no, we'll send you information. It's fine. We just need the numbers to go up. So I'm on Off the Ball talking about the census. So you see what I mean? That public service broadcast, can can we use some of the kindness that in others to protect our more vulnerable population? I don't know what the answer is to that. It's all of our jobs to try and resolve that, perhaps.
I think that's a sign of just quite how trusted you are. And I think you mentioned it before, but there's definitely a coalescing...
It went up 10% in a week. I'm taking credit. I'm taking credit. I'm taking full credit for it.
But you mentioned it early on. There's a coalescing of issues that we're beginning to see now, where trust and antitrust are coming through on lots of different issues. And I think for some reason there was targeting online of Facebook groups with anti-mask groups targeting with anti-census messages, and it's some strange things going on at the moment.
Yeah.
So really fascinating stuff. I'm going to have to wrap it up, I'm afraid. Jacqui's right, it could go on for hours. There's so much that we would, just like to, really? What did you say? How did you do that? I would love to, but we can't. We've got an online audience. We have to wrap up on time, I'm afraid. We really appreciate all the questions you've sent through on Slido. It's been fantastic reading them. I'm really sorry we can't get them through, and that is the challenge with hybrid events, balancing the questions in the room with the questions online. But it's our first trial, so please do email us afterwards and let us know how it's worked for you. Sorry about the technical issue on the sound, but I'm hoping Product Forge fixed it, fiddling away with the sound desk down there. So my job now is just to thank everyone. Thank you, Jacqui, for saying yes when you didn't actually quite know what I was ringing you up about out of the blue. And thank you, Jason, for having the conversation with our chair, Ken Barker, who set this all up, which is fantastic. And I'm only sorry that Ken can't be here to thank you himself, but he is on a walking holiday getting super fit and healthy. So thank you to everyone in the room. Please do stay and join us for a glass of wine afterwards. I'm sorry it's not quite so healthy. There is water there if you do want to be healthy.
That's a good thing.
And obviously thank you to Codebase and all the DHI team for making the event happen. So thank you for coming back for our first event, and we'll be back after the summer with more face-to-face, COVID allowing. So that's all that we need to do now, and just thank Jason and Jacqui.